Ziad Marar. I'm the Executive Vice President at Sage, and I'm responsible for our global publishing strategy. And really delighted to be here to introduce Gary King. The event is in a context of us wanting to look hard at research methods in general, and I'll come to that in a second. But it's great to see people representing policy making and the learner societies and media and faith bodies in one place. I hope you'll all actively engage with Gary when he's up and running. The format will be, I'll do just a few minutes of intro, and then Gary will talk for about 30 minutes and then take questions and answers, after which we will go for drinks. But he reassures me that if you want to interrupt him along the way, you're more than welcome to do that. I'd also like to say a quick thank you to the American Political Science Association and the American Statistical Association, both of whom have helped make this event happen, so thank you to everyone involved there. So, it's often said that data is to the 21st century what oil was to the 20th century. And that extraordinary fact has almost become mundane in our lives today. I think none of us are startled anymore to hear these gigantic numbers being bandied around. 1.5 billion people on Facebook, or as I looked up this morning, 40,000 Google searches per second. Where they become sort of the humdrum backdrop of our lives. Some people positive about them, others not so much. The negatives being kind of to say the business model of the internet surveillance versus, on the other hand, people saying never has there been before such an opportunity to improve human flourishing with all that's available through big data. And it's no surprise that organisations of various kinds have responded to this with alacrity. These organisations, many of whom are commercial organisations, are looking to get close to their customers and to send messages out as highly targeted as possible. And that's big and understandable stuff. And then similarly in the research community, the natural scientists and the physical scientists have similarly been responding very well. But I think with the social scientists, we've got a bit of a mixed story. And that while there's a huge amount of uptake, there's also a fair amount of caution expressed and a little bit of doubt expressed as well. And I think one of the reasons we wanted this event was really to help push the story of data-intensive social science a step along. And so the expressions of concern range from the nature of social science, problem domains, and issues around methodology and ethics. It's, a researcher studying social inequality will worry about the people who left off the digital grid more than a market researcher might. And people in social sciences will tend to worry more about privacy and the idea of informed consent, which isn't really an issue for a high-energy physicist. So we've got particular dynamics that apply to the social sciences. Nevertheless, I think a huge opportunity for social science to reinvent itself in the light of big data. And this is particularly important for us at Sage because our history has been as innovators in research methods since our founding. We were founded 51 years ago by Sarah Miller McCune, who thought of research methods as a really profound connective tissue across the research communities, across geographies, across fields, across levels from student to professor. And we've innovated, whether it's through the Little Green Books or the rise of qualitative research or mixed methods or evaluation through our history, and even today are still innovating, as by launching our Big Data in Society Open Access Journal, and more ways to talk about. What next? Well, I think data-intensive social science is what's next, and we feel that we can play a role in helping bring together these communities. And so, to our speaker, who is the very acme, I think, of what sort of the emblem, I think, of data-intensive social science in my head. He is not only is Professor Gary King an incredibly eminent academic on many fronts, but he's such a pioneer in this particular area. I know he needs no introduction, but as you will have seen in the documentation, he is the Professor Albert J. Weatherhead, the third university professor at Harvard University, and that university professor role only is held by 24 professors in the university. It's an incredibly elite and impressive role that he occupies. But it's not just about the contribution he makes as an individual academic. It's the fact that he's also the director of the Institute for Quantitative Social Science, which has led the way, I think, for many researchers to be able to take on this opportunity. And more than that, I think Gary's been very good at explaining to institutions how they could reconfigure themselves to take advantage of this opportunity as well. And so it's, I think, it requires massive collaboration to do it really well. And I think leading the path of the IQSS is one of the best things we've got to turn to. So I won't say more, we're short of time, so I'm going to just say it's an incredibly important moment in social science. SAGE is very committed to supporting that, and we couldn't think of a better keynote speaker to have than Professor Gary King. Please welcome him with me today. Thank you.
That's good enough. I don't want to take thoughts that you just end now. And thanks for the introduction. I really appreciate it. If anybody has any questions after I start talking, you should feel free to either yell them out or scream out obscenities or whatever it is you choose. That's totally fine. So that's me. These are SAGE's slides. Thanks for the ASA and APSA and SAGE and Zoom. No, thank you all for coming. I am for sponsoring this, I really appreciate it. And our members of Congress. So I'm going to talk about the big deal about big data, and I already gave the answer, which is it's not about the data. Okay? So that's not the innovation in big data. So what's the innovation? Well, let me explain. So data is easy to come by. It's a free byproduct of IT improvements in like every organization. If you buy it, it's becoming commoditized, so it's becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. If you ignore it, wherever you work, at the end of the year, you're going to have more data than you did at the beginning of the year, if you ignore it. If you pay any attention at all, you're going to have tons more data without putting in much effort at all. Okay. However, what are you going to do with all that data? It's not very helpful by itself, right? Because you have to manage it. It's valuable, so you have to keep it, right? So basically it's an expense. It doesn't actually do anything good for you. Hold on, there's more to the story. The value is the analytics. The revolution is the analytics. The revolution that we didn't know how to do, the thing that we did not know how to do before, but we know how to do now, or we're learning how to do now, is how to make the data actionable. That's really the secret. I love the phrase big data, not because it describes anything accurately, but because the media has figured out a way to describe what we do and what SAGE publishes and what many of you do in a way that, my mom now thinks she understands what I do. Okay? Right? And really, like the public genuinely gets this now. Well, they don't completely get it, but they get it much more than they did previously. And basically, we failed to communicate this to them, but somebody in the media, or the media collectively, has figured that out, and that's really valuable. But the value is not the data. It's not the big, it's the analytics. You can customize the output for exactly what you want. I like it to contrast it with Moore's law. So what Moore's law is? It's a prediction, an empirically accurate prediction, it turns out, that the speed and power of computers will double every 18 months, which has produced a lot of value. That's a really good thing. Okay? However, Moore's law is like nothing compared to like one student data scientist who works on algorithms, who in an afternoon can increase the speed of the computer plus the algorithm by a factor of 1,000. That's like not that big a deal. That happens quite regularly. Moore's law never got close to that. Okay? And no objection to Moore's law. Okay, we need that, right? But don't miss that we have the real value. I'll give one more example, and it won't be a current conference call. We'll work on that. A colleague had lots of data coming in and ran a particular analysis every year. And the data got bigger, right? There was more data this year, there's more data next year, there's more data next year, and all of a sudden there was more data than could fit on his computer. And so he called down to the IT shop and said, spec me out a new computer. I need a bigger computer to be able to do this. And so my guys at the Institute for Quantitative Social Science, which I run, thank you for mentioning that, Hi guys, and one woman. If you ever find a female CISA, you hire her. That's my instructions to her. We have one, okay? And she may be the only one, but she's one. In any event, so my guys spec out the cost of this computer, and the cost of the computer is $2 million. Now, that's a beefy computer. It is possible to raise money to buy a $2 million computer. It's a real thing, a $2 million computer. We don't know a lot about a $2 million computer, but that's what it was to do. And so we intercepted this, a graduate student and I, and we worked on it for almost 2 hours. And now this professor runs this algorithm on his laptop in 20 minutes. So this is actually, the most amazing thing about this story is that it's not even amazing. It happens like all the time, right? The innovation is the analytics. Okay? It's low cost, it's little infrastructure. All you need to do is like hire my students. It's mostly human capital. That's really what it is. It's important to understand also that if you go from no analytics to just ordinary off-the-shelf analytics, you have a huge improvement. If you go, however, it's important to understand, from ordinary off-the-shelf analytics to innovative analytics tuned to your problem, it's orders of magnitude better. So it's just worth remembering that. And what's ordinary is drastically changing over time, because that's really the revolution. We've learned more about causal inference, the effect of something on something else, and prediction, what's going to happen in the future, more in the last 20 or 30 years than at any point in human history. It's quite amazing. And the cool thing is we don't get to be a part of this. It's happening in the social sciences. So, let me give you some context. There's exciting data, but without the analytics, it's quite useless. So an example is exercise. The way they used to measure exercise is they would do a survey and they would say, how many times in the last week did you exercise? And how many times did you get on the treadmill? You know the answer to that question. But that's not necessarily related to how much energy you output, right? If you're, so how can you measure it? Well, you all have cell phones in your pockets, like that. We can put a little piece of software in there if you don't mind. There's also an accelerometer in your cell phone, which says how much you move. And the little piece of software will just send us the information to be used only for scientific purposes, I promise. Now we have, let's say, 500,000 people with this little piece of software in their cell phone. We have continuous time information on how much they're moving. Think of how much more valuable that is than how many times in the last week did you exercise. It's hugely more valuable. However, what are you going to do with this trace of information about how much you exercise second by second for 500,000 people over the course of, I don't know, a month? What do you do with that information? Right? Moreover, how are you going to distinguish the couch potato sleeping on the train like this, right? compared to the person on the stationary bike doing an all-out sprint who's not moving, runs the accelerometer, right? with their cell phone on the next door. Right? How do you distinguish that? You need the analytics in order to interpret the data appropriately. It's not just the data. Another example is, in order for democracy to work, you need activists. You need people pursuing office. If no one pursues office, Democrats, Republicans, whatever, then there really isn't any point in having democracy. So political scientists track activists. It's important to all of us. So the way they used to do it was a few thousand interviews. In fact, there's a famous book by some colleagues of mine where they took a random sample of the United States public of 15,000 people, and they asked them screener questions, weeded it down to maybe the 2,000 that are actually activists, and then asked a long series of questions, and wrote a big book on the one snapshot of 2,000 people. And I realized that today, there are 650 million social media posts that are available publicly for us to analyze. 650 million. And people write about everything, including basically everything about politics. Things that would drive you crazy and things that you would like, okay? And everything in between and everything else. That's an enormously more information than the information we used to get. Okay? Only what are you supposed to do with 650 million social media posts, right? Quite a lot of them are, about cat videos, right? Like, what are you supposed to do? How do you analyze that data? Once you have the the analytics, then it turns out we can turn that into meaningful information. Or take social contacts. The way that you do this in many, many high-quality surveys is, please give me a list of your 5 best friends. And then we ask just for the first names, so that we can then ask you more questions about it. Alternatively, if you give us permission, and we will protect it, we can have a continuous record of phone calls and emails and text messages and food suits and social media connections and you name it, right? So the amount of information could be enormous, but what are we supposed to do with that information? It requires detailed and sophisticated and analytic tools to be able to extract information. Or economic development in developing countries. One option is you get the information from the governments. I once traced the source of information about AIDS in Africa. Right? But where does that come from? Right? Because they don't really have the institutional structure to be able to estimate this. You know, this village is off far from. Where is this actually coming from? Turns out that where it was coming from was a guy in the World Health Organization named Alan. He really, and what Alan would do is he'd get the data from the governments who would give them numbers when he would ask, and then he'd look at them and he'd say, that's not right. And he'd cross it off and he'd write the other number, and then that became the official record of AIDS in Africa. Alan, by the way, was really good. You wanted his numbers rather than the government's. But still, that's not an empirical method. Or not the empirical method you want. So now, if you want to measure, let's say GDP, we can get satellite images of human-generated light at night. You know, those photographs, okay? Or road networks, or infrastructure, or things like that. An undergraduate of mine studied Chinese investment in Africa and used differences in satellite imagery for where the investment was and whether the investment actually had any effect over a 10-year period. You can actually see it, right? Rather than just talking to somebody, asking them what they remember, what's here 10 years. There's many, many more things, but in each, without the new analytics, the data are useless. Okay, let me just put this in context of the social sciences. In 1995, Science magazine asked 60 scientists about the future of their field. They said, what's going to happen over the next 25 years? And they asked for these, half-column descriptions from 60 scientists. Every one of the natural and physical scientists said, we're going to make the most amazing discoveries and inventions, and we're going to cure these amazing diseases. And every single one of the smaller number of social scientists that answered the question said, well, we used to be studying this, and it's really exciting because now we're going to be studying this. And that pissed me off. Right? It is important to be studying this and that, but it's also important to be actually solving problems. And the change in the social sciences is we're changing from studying them to actually solving problems. So I'm going to try to give you some of those examples today. So here's my first. How do you like this sentence? How do we read 1 trillion social media posts and classify deaths without physicians? Now, I use the sentence mostly because it's never been uttered before in the history of humanity. But also because I'm going to show you the same underlying methods enable you to solve completely different problems. So that's the power of social science methodology. That you can solve problems that you couldn't have solved otherwise, and you can also solve problems that you never even realized existed. So here's some examples, basically examples of bad analytics. First one is verbal autopsies. What the heck is that? Okay. If somebody dies in the United States, there's a death certificate. And someone sees the body, a medical personnel, doctor sees the body, signs the death certificate, says the person died from lung cancer, whatever it was. In most of the developing world, that is in most countries in the world, when someone dies, they basically go off the bush and they're never heard from again. No one sees the body. Autopsies are culturally prohibited. Right? You basically don't know. Right? Moreover, these are the places where we have to really figure out what people are dying from, because that's where diseases emerge. They might affect us. Okay? And actually, it's going to have disastrous effects in these places without hospital infrastructure and things like that. So, how do you measure the prevalence of different diseases in countries without this kind of data? So, what they do is verbal autopsies. Well, what's a verbal autopsy? You go to a household where someone's died, and you find the next of kin or the caretaker, and You can ask a series of sort of uncomfortable questions. You know, did the person have stomach pain before they died? Did they have bleeding from their eyes? Did they, did they have tire tracks across their back? That's a joke. You ask them questions to try to figure out what the cause of death is. And then you give the answers, maybe 50 answers to the 50 questions, to a physician. And then the physician says, that was tuberculosis. And then some smart aleck scientist came along and said, social scientist, by the way, came along and said, let's give that to another physician. You give it to another physician and they say, malaria. And it turned out that when we did this systematically with lots of examples, the physicians were useless in this context. Physicians to be useful needed to see the body, needed to do tests, but verbal autopsies, just the physicians were useless. So what do you do? Well, let's think about that. Okay, we'll put that over here. Okay. And think about what they're trying to do. What they're trying to do is classify individuals into categories of death. Okay, now hold that thought. Another thing people do is sentiment analysis by word counts. So you see this a lot. Okay? You see in the media, you see people investing on the basis of Twitter and things like that. And what they're doing is they're counting the number of tweets with certain words. Let me give you an example of the kinds of things that can happen when you do this. There was a group that was trying to predict U.S. unemployment rates. And they thought, well, let's do this with social media. We can do this better than the government. Let's count the number of times people say classified or jobs or unemployment or all these things, right? We'll count the number of tweets that have these words, and they did. And they plotted them over time. And they correlated with official government U.S. unemployment rates. And they preceded them. So they were able to predict U.S. unemployment rates with the word counts. What happens, though, is you can do a little of this well, but then it fails catastrophically. Okay? It's not, as a side point, it's quite unlike heart surgery. You don't do that like a little bit. You either do heart surgery or don't do heart surgery. You don't feel unwell at dinner and ask someone to pass a steak knife to fix something. Okay, let me go back to this. Okay. So this is something people do a little, and actually they were predicting unemployment rates to some degree from this. And then they noticed one day there was a spike in the number of these words used. And they thought, let's invest. And they started investing. And what happened? What they didn't notice was that was the day Steve Jobs died. And they didn't notice that Steve's last name was one of the words that they were counting. Okay, so catastrophic. Both of these fail. Now the interesting thing is, they're completely unrelated substantive problems, but they have the same solution. And the reason why is the key to both methods. The reason both methods were failing is they were classified. As it happens in public health, people in public health, they're not your doctor. People in public health don't care about anyone, they only care about everyone. Okay, so that's interesting. They don't care what you die of, they don't care about the proportion of people dying from a particular disease. And when we study Twitter, no one cares what StatPumpkin222 says. Okay? Right? It doesn't matter what anybody has to say, it only matters what everybody has to say. Okay? If you think about that, the individual classification decisions are not the quantity of interest. What's the quantity of interest? What do we actually care about? What we actually care about is the percent in a category. We care about the percent of people dying from malaria. In the United States, that's 0. 0. That's an effective number. 0. We need to devote no resources to malaria. Okay, good. Okay. In other parts of the world, that's not 0, so we have to devote more resources. We care about the percentage. We don't care who died from malaria. Well, you and I might, but as public health professionals, we wouldn't. Similarly, for estimating sentiment by or U.S. unemployment rates from word counts, we don't really care about any one of these tweets. We only care about the percentage that fall in the category. Now, you're probably thinking, wait a second, how do you get the percentage? You just put them all in the categories, add them up, you get the percentage. And if you're thinking that, you'd be absolutely right. Except, you just assumed that every time you put it in the category, you got it right. If you don't get it right all the time, those are two different things. Right? So let's take all pairs of countries every year since World War II. 1,000 of those million pairs of countries were at war. So now let's come up with a prediction of the proportion of pairs of countries at war. Well, a really good prediction, that will be right, nearly 100% of the time, is there's never been any war, right? So that's useless information, right? The percent correctly predicted is really high, and we don't get a good estimate of the thing that we really care about, right? So classification, although it seemed like that was the way to get there, only gets us there if we're perfect, and we're never perfect, okay? Okay, so what does that help us? What does that do? So what that does is all of a sudden we realize that methodologically we care about the second thing, not the first thing. And if there's another way of getting to the second thing, estimating the percentages in the categories, we don't even care whether we do a worse job than the first thing. And that's what we did. We developed a set of methods that gets us estimates of the percent in the category that's accurate on average. It's called unbiased, this is a statistical term. It doesn't even classify all individuals. I realize it sounds like magic. If anybody wants, I'm happy to explain all the math. In fact, if anybody flinches, I will. But basically, we came up with a way of estimating the percent in a category. Once we realized what the quantity of interest is, we used the tools that we've all developed. We developed new statistical procedures to be able to do this. And the really cool thing was, it solved these two completely unrelated problems. Actually, I was working on the first problem for the World Health Organization. And we could solve this problem. And for a year, I was trying to solve the sentiment analysis problem. And I tried every method that computer scientists had come up with, and everything was a complete disaster. It just was nowhere near close. Until one day, and I tried things, and I give them to my graduate students, and I'd say, hey, I found this new thing in the literature, why don't you try this? And then, like, every morning, they would roll their eyes at me, and think, this one's not going to work, none of the others work. And then one day I realized, mathematically, these two problems are exactly the same. And our method works very well for verbal autopsies. So it will work here. And I tell my graduate students, it will work, and when they're rolling their eyes. But no, I said mathematically this, and it actually works. So, so the consequence of this is modern data analytics led to us developing these algorithms. We actually, Harvard patented them and licensed them to a startup company called Crimson Hexagon. They have around 200 employees. They go around the world and collect social media posts. They have about 1 trillion social media posts, so that's actually a real number there. And they do brand monitoring for people. I helped found this company. I put this up here. Crimson Hexagon, I'm very proud, was named one of the seven of the top 10 most innovative companies on the web, which I mentioned primarily because my brother works at Microsoft, and Microsoft was number 9. And also, the same exact method, in fact, the same code is used by the World Health Organization and others to estimate the cause of death by the prevalence by cause of death in countries all over the world. So that's the cool stuff that we get to be involved in social science methodology. Okay. Now I'm going to completely switch subjects. Okay. So if you fall asleep, it's best to fall asleep right between slides, and then okay. So these are more examples. We're in Washington, right? And just so you know. So the United States Social Security Administration is the incarnation of the Social Security program, right? The single largest government program, lifted a whole generation out of poverty, extremely popular, highly partisan, the third rail of American politics and so on, right? The essence of the program it provides benefits to retirees and people who are disabled and families. In order for the program to succeed, to survive, the Social Security Administration must forecast how much it is in the Social Security Trust Fund. That's what everything depends upon. Those forecasts are used by the Social Security Administration to make the whole thing work. So if retirees draw benefits out too long, if someone invents a pill, and we all live to 200, we'll be cheering, so we realize there's not enough money in Social Security to pay for us all, and the trust fund will go insolvent, and we won't be able to have enough money for retirement. So the forecasts are essential to this program and to keeping people out of poverty. It really matters. Moreover, many other United States government programs depend upon these forecasts. And those programs are run based upon what the forecast said. More than half of the United States government expenditures depend upon these forecasts. More than half. Okay, so we looked at these forecasts. The interesting thing is, these forecasts have been made for 85 years. Right? And they weren't forecasting 85 years ahead of time. So we have this amazing scientific opportunity to evaluate forecasts, real out-of-sample forecasts, because the year they were forecasting actually occurred. So we can actually see how well they did. So we used a very complicated statistical method to compare the truth and the estimate. The method is known as subtraction. To evaluate these forecasts. The methods, as it turns out, have been little changed in 85 years. They're mostly qualitative. And these 85 years are not just any 85 years in the history of the country or the world. These are the 85 years in which we've learned more about forecasting, as I mentioned a minute ago, than at any time in human history. And this is the time that the United States Social Security Administration chose not to update the methods by which they forecast, by which they ensure the solvency of our retirement. Okay? So this seemed like it was worthy of us paying somewhat more attention to. Okay, so we did quite an extensive study. What are the results of this? Well, until about the year 2000, the forecasts were about unbiased, which is what you would want. It's not fair to ask of the actuaries who make the forecasts that their forecasts be spot on. They are forecasting the future, after all. We don't know. The future's uncertain. You heard it. Until 2000, for 85, for 75 years, however many that is, they made forecasts. Sometimes they were too high, sometimes they were too low, but on average they were about right. That's what we see. Since 2000, however, they became systematically biased. And it's not just one forecast, it's a whole bunch of forecasts. And every forecast was biased in the same direction. Every forecast was biased in the direction of making the system look healthier than it really is. Every single one. Why is that? As a side point, why is that? Well, we're looking ahead, I noticed that. Why is that? Well, as social scientists, we do quantitative work. We're quantifying things. We never leave behind the qualitative evidence. Because it's impossible to quantify all information. There's always going to be essential information that human beings have that we're not going to be able to completely quantify. And so we also did interview people, and we figured out what the reason was. Like, how come this all was biased? Is it just some partisan scheme? No, actually, that's not what it is. What happened is, Social Security became much more partisan. That's absolutely true. Both the Democrats and the Republicans are at fault. They both pushed very hard. They're not actually at fault, but they changed the environment. The actuaries did what we would want good public servants to do. They hunkered down and protected themselves from the Democrats and the Republicans, who might like the forecast to go this way or go this way, right? Because it would be convenient for their political arguments in changing public policy. The actuaries resisted that, just like we want. But the actuaries also resisted pretty much everything else, including the data. And as it happens, and they insulated themselves basically from the facts and the data. Since about 2000, as it happens, Americans started living unexpectedly longer lives. Not in every category, not every person, but on average, they started living unexpectedly longer lives. If you're taking statins, keep taking them. Well, don't take medical advice from a political scientist. But we started living longer lives. Like it actually, like these kinds of innovations actually matter. You can see it in the data, and that's a really terrific thing. But it changed the forecast. Like you have different inputs, you should change the outputs. Okay? People smoked less. That's good. But they ate more, that's bad. The smoking less was better than the eating more, right? It was bad, and that wound up working out so that mortality was decreasing at a rate faster than expected. That's not necessarily going to happen, can continue to happen, but they ignored the data. And as a result of ignoring the data, they just missed what some people estimated from our data was $1 trillion error. Okay, so in addition to this complicated method of subtraction, we also created an actual complicated method of forecasting. We came up with a better method of forecasting. How should the actuaries actually forecast? And we developed new social science statistical methods that can forecast much more accurately. They are, for example, logically consistent. Like Unfortunately, older people have higher mortality rates than younger people. You would expect that. The methods the Social Security Administration are using even to this day don't require that. There's quite a number of other logical consistencies. They also produce much more accurate forecasts. The last time we ran this, the trust fund needed $800 billion more than the actuaries actually indicated. So, you know, bummer, but at least I think we have better information. This, by the way, doesn't say anything about what public policy should be. Right? You know, our elected politicians get to make these decisions somehow, or not make the decisions. That's also a decision. But we hope to give them much better facts on which to make the decisions, and I think we've done that. Deep breath, fall asleep, wake up, new subject. Okay. Gerrymander, redrawing legislative district boundaries. You know, the boundaries of a legislative district. This is a really troubling area, hugely troubling area. It is the most conflictual form of politics in the United States, the most predictable form of conflictual politics in the United States, short of violence. And in many areas, it doesn't stop short of violence. There's a lot of examples which we collect of fistfights on the floor of legislatures, almost all over redistricting. This is a big deal. For incumbents, there's hardly things that are more frustrating than redistricting. Because what happens is, somebody in the basement who looks a little like me is redrawing district boundaries and deciding who gets to keep their job or not. Right? That's a hard job these folks have. Right? Unfortunately, they don't do this for professors. Right? And for voters, it's the same kind of frustration. They're not going to lose their job as a result of redistricting, but they'll lose their representative, and they'll be in a different district, and they may have had information about who they would vote for, and now all of a sudden they don't because there's a different configuration of candidates. So this is a really difficult area. It's very, very, very partisan. It produces a train wreck of litigation on cue. Like every 10 years after the census, they allocate districts or congressional seats to states, and then every state has to redistrict, and then every state has to have litigation. It's a complete train wreck. There's huge amounts of money wasted. Both sides do whatever they can to get an advantage. So, analytically, from a social science perspective, what are the problems here? Well, first of all, there was no agreed upon standard of partisan fairness. Right? How do you know what a fair redistricting plan is? And secondly, there was no method by which we could estimate whether a plan met the standard. So we needed standards and we needed methods. Secondly, in order to figure out whether the Voting Rights Act applies, the courts required estimates of whether blacks and whites and Asians and Hispanics were voting the same way. But we actually have this thing in the United States called the secret ballot, and so although the law says you must tell us how different people are voting, the law also says you may not know. Okay? That's where the social sciences come in. Because we can estimate these things. We can develop, and that's I'm getting good at myself. So we have solutions. Okay. So the solutions were not about the data. The data have been available for years. Right? There are census data, and there's election data, and there's where the districts are, and there's data at the precinct level, and the census block level. We have lots of data. First, we needed a standard. So I and some co-authors developed a standard for partisan fairness, for what it means for a set of legislative districts to be fair to both parties. So we developed a standard. It is agreed to pretty much by all. That is, by both parties in almost all redistricting litigation, including cases that have been decided by the Supreme Court in this term and many other terms, by Supreme Court justices that have written about it, by many other courts all across the land. They basically agree with the standard of partisan fairness. We also developed a sequence of statistical methods, each one of which better than the previous, or at least so we claimed in order to get it published. But at least that was the theory. And the methods estimate on the basis of the data and the plans, the different plans offered by the different parties and citizen groups, etc. How fair each plan was. And these basically are agreed to pretty much by everybody. when the parties who hate each other, they all use the same methods, which is really terrific. We've also developed what are now very widely used methods for estimating group behavior, that is individual group behavior from aggregate data. So if you only know the percentage of African Americans in this district, and you know the percentage of people voting for the Democrats, and there's lots of African Americans and lots of people voting for the Democrats, it might be that the African Americans are voting for the Democrats, but it could actually be that lots of whites that live in districts with African Americans are the ones voting for the Democrats. Well, then that's known as an ecological inference problem. So we've come up with methods that enable us to get around these problems. They're uncertain, as you might imagine, because there's information loss. But these are now used in pretty much every court by experts on all sides. So these are just some ways that social sciences have actually made some contributions. Are you ready for a different example? Okay, keywords. It's the obvious next example, don't you think? Humans, I'm going to make the case, are horrible at choosing keywords. Now, wait a second, that seems ridiculous. We all do Google searches every day. I'm going to convince you that you are horrible at doing Google searches. Well, you're horrible thinking of keywords. Here's an experiment. You can play along if you want. We actually did this, we ran this experiment with 43 undergraduates at a nice college in northeastern United States in Massachusetts, near, sort of around Cambridge, Massachusetts. So we gave this to our 43 undergraduates. We said, we have 10,000 Twitter posts, each containing the word Boston. So the 10,000 posts each use the word Boston from the time period around the Boston Marathon bombings, when all of us up there were hunkered down in our houses because they closed the roads and they said, you can't go out. Please list any keywords, this is the task I want you to do. Please list any keywords which come to mind that select posts in this set of tweets related to the bombings, but won't pick posts that are unrelated to the bombings. So don't pick the word the, right? Because it's in both. You have to pick words that are just related to the bombings. Okay, so you think about what that is. How many words can you think of? Just think of it. Okay. I won't pick anybody out from the crowd. Okay, so here's some examples. Okay, explosion, right? Lockdown. However you say this guy's name. Terrorist. These are the kinds of words that people chose. Maybe some of you chose these words. I guess it's very few chose these words. Am I right? I'll show you why. Okay. The median number of keywords thought of when we gave them plenty of time for our undergraduates was 8. Each person came up with, some more, some less, but on average they came up with about 8. The number of unique keywords chosen or thought of across all the 43 undergraduates was 149 unique keywords. Okay. Each person can only think of about 8. So let's ask the question. For each unique keyword, how many of them were thought of by one person, and when given a chance, by 42 other people, every single one of them fails to think of it? That's pretty dramatic, right? How many? Turns out 2/3 of the time. 2/3 of the time. So, what does that mean exactly? That means humans recognize keywords well. If I show you a keyword and I ask you, is this relevant to the bombings or not relevant to the not bombings, you'd know right away. I give you these examples right away. You knew they were relevant, right? So we're very good at recognition. We suck at recall. Okay. In fact, we're so bad at recall that I can convince you that our brains have an inhibitory process that causes us to forget things, which is sort of a cool fact. Okay. Why would that happen? I can explain why it happens, but let me make it happen to you right now. Okay. Do you know the idea of it's on the tip of my tongue? That's an inhibitory process, something in your brain causing you to not remember something. So no one speak. Okay. Think of your bank password. That's why I asked you not to speak. Now think of your previous bank password. Now, let's assume you don't rotate them because the bank tells you not to do that. Now think of the bank password before that. Okay. My guess is almost nobody can think of it. Okay. But if I showed it to you, that would be a really cool magic trick. And that's how I get college. But if I showed it to you, don't you agree you would recognize it? Okay, so that's the thing. We're good at recognition. We suck at recall. Surprising, but it's true. Okay, so what do we do about that? We developed some new technology. We call it Thresher. And this technology, like most really good technologies, does not fully automate the human away. Because fully automated technologies usually do stupid things. Like a driverless car without anyone to tell the driverless car where to go. It wouldn't be very useful. It would drive around in circles, right? Fully automated doesn't really do anything. Fully human is inadequate. I just showed you. You are inadequate. We are all inadequate. We're humans. Right? So what this technology does is it suggests words to you so that you can do recognition, which you're good at, rather than recall, which you're bad at. Okay, so let me give you an example. We want to find those hiding in plain sight. We were studying China, the Chinese censorship. I'll give you an example of Chinese censorship in a minute. But we use this technology, this Thresher technology, in order to find the following. So first of all, I'll give you an example. Okay, so anybody speak Chinese? You know what that is? Freedom, that's right, that's the word freedom. If you use the word freedom in China on certain websites, but not others, certain social media websites, it'll be filtered out. Okay? And you write it in your social media post and you use that word, you won't see it. It'll be filtered out. Not everyone, but a lot of them. Okay? So what do people do? Right? Well, if you have to rewrite a sentence without a word, it'll be no problem. Right? You can find some way of writing around it. Okay? What do? They use this word. Those who speak Chinese, do you know what this is? This is, well, first of all, look closely, okay? Because this is not the same as this. It's close, but it's not the same. Okay? This means I field. An I and a big field of daisies. It has no meaning at all. Okay? So what people say is, we need more I field in China. And if you speak Chinese and you see that, you recognize that the writer means that. It's very clever, okay? Right? And this is known as a homogram. Here's another example. This means harmonious society, which is the official slogan of the Communist Party. This is filtered out. They don't want you to talk about that. So what do? Well, they don't use that. They use this. What is that? Well, it turns out this means river crab. Okay? And they say the policy of river crab totally sucks. Okay? Well, why are they doing that? The reason why is because if you say these two words, which I have tried so many times, and anybody who speaks Chinese in the audience doesn't think I came anywhere near close, but this is of course irrelevant. But this is known as a homophone. These two sound almost the same. Can you say them? Can you say them? That's right. Or here's another example. This is Bo Guoguo, who was the son of Bo Xilai. And Bo Xilai was the guy that came down in the big scandal in China in 20 years. Okay. So you use the word Guoguo, and they censor it out. Okay. So how did people write about this? This was the most fascinating event in China. If you were in China, you would want to write about it and read about it and figure it out. Okay? And we, in the United States, studying China, for all these cases, we wanted to follow the thread of the conversation. When the people we were studying were incredibly creative and innovative and making up new things, we still wanted to follow the thread of the conversation. If we had to sit there and think of words, like in the Boston bombings example, we would fail because we have these inadequacies. But in this case, we would fail even if we were incredibly good, because how would we think of something like that? Yeah. Right? You know? Okay, go. Instead, they changed the first Chinese letter to an English letter B. Okay, I can sort of get that. They leave off the next one. That sort of makes sense. Okay, they use the second two. Okay. They use B melon. Why is that? Well, one of these characters by itself actually means melon. Okay. Or ABB. Why would that be? We had to research this. It turns out that the princelings, the sons and daughters of the Politburo people, for whatever reason, have names that are like Bo Guoguo, ABB. And so ABB is an abbreviation for princeling. So they use ABB, right? So this is basically versions of slang. Some of which you might have actually thought of if you were, had a really good day, okay? But, the Chinese people are doing this continuously. How would you be able to follow this? We use this technology to follow this kind of thing. Let me tell you about our China study. This is so fun. This is more general. Okay? The previous approach to studying censorship in China was talk to somebody that had a post taken down. Like somebody would write a post and notice that it was taken down. That's what they do in China. They read the posts and they take down the ones they don't like. It's sort of amazing because there are millions of ones of posts. Well, the problem is that one person watching that would be like an ant on an anthill. They don't get to see the big picture. Right? So what we did is we noticed that we were able to, surprisingly, actually very surprised, we were very surprised, and we figured out how to download all Chinese language social media posts before the Chinese government could read and censor them. Right? So we had the entire corpus of Chinese language social media posts that the Chinese people couldn't read because they weren't allowed to, but we couldn't. Not because we were allowed to, but because we had them. And so then we developed a network of computers around the world to check on each of the posts to see whether it was taken down. And then, so now we have two piles of posts, one censored, one uncensored. And we use methods of automated text analysis that we developed in the social science methodology to try to figure out what the Chinese government is after. Okay, about 13% of the censored overall, just to orient you. Now, I'll tell you what we found. Overall, everybody knows the goal of censorship, right? The goal of censorship is to stop criticism and protest about the state, its leaders, and their policies. So we knew that goal, and so we went in with that goal, we analyzed the data, and the first thing we learned is that it was utterly and completely wrong. Like we got nothing remotely related to this goal. So we thought, well, okay, that's a good starting point. It would be nice to have an ending point also. And so we started to look at the data in many different ways until we finally hit upon a way that made some sense. We asked, what could be the goal? What we did is we broke up the question. We said, well, maybe the goal is to stop criticism of the state, its leaders, and their policies, or maybe the goal is to stop collective action, stop protests. Okay. And we separated the two. Once we separated the two, we had the theoretical idea to separate the two. All of a sudden, everything incredibly clarified. It's like when you're at the eye doctor and they go, is it one or is it two? It's two, right? Because all of a sudden you can see that there's someone across the room. Okay. What happened? The first was wrong, the second was right. Let me explain what that means. In China, what everybody thought was you couldn't criticize the government. What is actually the case is you can criticize the government. You can say whatever you want about the government. You can say the leaders of this town are all stealing money. Here's how much. These are the bank accounts they have the money hidden in overseas. And by the way, they all have mistresses, and here are their names. That won't be censored. But if you say, and let's go protest, that would be censored. Okay. In fact, if you say, the leaders of this town are doing such a great job, let's have a big rally in their favor. Censored. They don't care what you think about them. They're a bunch of dictators. What should you think? Right? They only care what you can do. They're not afraid of the United States government and our big military power. They have nuclear weapons. What are we going to do? Attack them? Right? It's not going to happen. What are they afraid of? They're afraid of their own people. Right? So their own people. How could their own people affect them? Their own people could affect them if they rise up and have another big Tiananmen Square event. It spreads contagiously across the country. Right? So they stop collective action. The implications of this are really interesting. The implications is that social media then is not really something cool to study. It becomes actionable. It's actionable for the Chinese leaders, and therefore it's actionable for us. For the Chinese leaders, they measure criticism to judge local officials. If you are in charge of China, what do you want? What do you want? Well, do you have more power than Barack Obama and Bill Gates combined? Do you want to keep a good thing going? Okay. How do you keep a good thing going? Well, you make sure there's no collective action. How do you do that? Well, there's between 50 and 700,000 units across governmental units across China, depending on how you count. Okay? You appoint all of your best friends to run them, okay? And then a whole lot of other people to run them. And then what happens if one of them isn't doing a good job? Well, there may be protests, and then protests may spread contagiously across the country, and then you might lose your job. How do you watch all those people? Well, actually, social media is a really good way. You can see whether they're being criticized. And it turns out we can use how much they're being criticized to predict whether or not they're going to lose their job, because they're using that. And of course, they censor to stop events with collective action potential. So we all thought they'll stop, they won't allow criticism, but they allow criticism because it's useful for them. We, as academics, can use the criticism and the censorship to predict officials in trouble and likely to be replaced, or dissidents. Like before they're arrested, censorship goes up very substantially on a particular dissident, they need to die, okay? Because they get arrested 4 or 5 days later. Or a peace treaty between Vietnam and China. They found oil in the South China Sea between those 2 countries. And both countries started taking a real liking to that body of water. And the media is talking about about the potential conflict between the two countries, and they're sort of shooting across each other's bow over the equivalent. And so, well, what happened? We noticed censorship was soaring. And then one day we noticed, no one else did because nobody else had the data, we noticed it just stopped. They stopped censoring completely. What's the media talking about at that time? They're talking about maybe there's going to be a war. What's going to happen? There's going to be some conflagration. Yes. But we noticed censorship had stopped. 4 or 5 days later, they signed a peace treaty with Vietnam. We don't know for sure, but we think what happened was they made a deal, and they told the censors, don't worry about it, and they signaled. What's happening here is that you have a giant operation within the Chinese government designed to slow the flow of information, but it's so large that it conveys a lot about the intentions and goals of the Chinese leaders. It's like a big elephant tiptoeing around. It leaves big footprints. And if you look at scale with big data social science methods, you can actually see these things ahead of time. Okay. And emerging scandals and things like that. Disagreements between central leaders and local leaders. We can also see those things. I'm going to, let's see the time. Okay, I'm going to skip 2 slides and give you one final. You agree with everything on these slides, right? Okay. All right, let me tell you about one final message, which is written up there. Okay. So I want to ask you the following question. Right. What university research has had the biggest impact on your lives personally? Okay. Now let's think about what the biggest kinds of things universities have done. Well, first of all the progress in the last 400 years has come from science, and most of that, not all of it by any means, but quite a lot of it has come from university research. You can think of this as research if you want, and university research. What research has had the biggest impact on you? What university research? Maybe the genetics revolution. We spent a lot of money on the genetics revolution. The genetics revolution has taught us an enormous amount about the basic biology of what's going on, but it's something that value up until now in terms of curing diseases, at least according relative to its predictions. You think that's going to change, but we're not there yet. Or how about the Higgs-like particle, or gravity waves more recently? Actually, to me, those are just like the coolest things that you could possibly see. But how much does it have an effect on your lives personally? Some. Just the wonder is totally worth the cost and way more than we pay for these things. Okay, I'm totally in favor. But I just want to put it in context. How about exoplanets and the Mars rovers? Yes. Please pay these. How about doubling life expectancy in the last century? Yes. Okay. There's a lot of things that belong in this list. My only argument here in my last slide today is that on this list also belongs I was hoping it was going to come up. Also belongs quantitative social science. It also belongs on this list of the most important innovations the most important ways that university research has impacted you in your lives. Let's think about what it's actually done. First of all, what is it? Well, it's actually big data, or big data applied to people. We sometimes call it data science, or data analytics, or statistics, or econometrics, or clinical methodology, or there's actually like 100 different terms. And you can use Russian technology to discover all those words that you wouldn't think of. What has quantitative social science done? Well, it's transformed most Fortune 500 companies into data producers, data analyzers, and data monetizers. It's transformed most Fortune 500 companies. It's established whole new industries. It's altered friendship networks. Facebook is basically a social science innovation. It's increased. So what is social media? Social media is the largest increase in the expressive capacity of the human race in the history of the world. That's cool. Okay. It's changed political campaigns completely. Hasn't produced the outcomes we want, but we don't mess with the outcomes. Okay. It's transformed public health. It's changed legal analysis. It's not discovery anymore, it's e-discovery. It's impacted crime and policing in huge ways, military as well. Reinvented economics, transformed sports. Have you seen Moneyball? It's transformed sports. Who would have thought content social science would have an effect on sports? It sets standards for evaluating public policy. We did an experiment in Mexico where we evaluated their healthcare system, and we did a randomized experiment, the largest randomized experiment in health policy ever, where we randomly assigned hospitals and doctors and medicines and money to pay for it all to communities, and learned a tremendous amount, and they got to improve their health system, and literally millions of people got healthcare that wouldn't have got it otherwise because we did this evaluation. It was really a gratifying kind of thing to be able to participate in. Anyway, this was the three etceteras, because there's lots of other things that quantitative social science has had an impact on. And so, if you're anywhere part of or touch this world, I just want you to remember that this belongs on that list. And I thank you for all your time. Nobody interrupted me. I'm sorry, I apologize for not insisting that you interrupt. So interrupt me now. Oh, excellent.
Yeah. And mortality statistics go back hundreds of years. So how could the Republican or Democrats disagree on mortality statistics? I mean, there's no hope if that's the case.
Well, that's kind of the context. So politicians don't have to agree with the facts. They can use facts any way they want. We're in a democracy. The truth is one of many considerations. And so the politicians can decide on whatever basis they want. We're not going to tell them how to decide. I agree with you that it would be nice to have the facts on the table. And the current mortality statistics, the fact is everybody does agree with it. Forecasts about them, we should be using best practices. Absolutely. The fact that we're not is hurts us all. Democrats, Republicans, retirees, workers, everybody. I completely agree. There's no reason for that.
Thank you.
Run.
Thank you for a great talk. First, a comment on the Social Security Administration. There were many over years following 2000 who said that the actuaries were just extrapolating, they weren't taking into account myriad factors like you point out, healthcare and changing lifestyles and the like. And Sam Preston and others repeatedly showed in their research how that did change their thinking. So a lot of this has to do with the culture of an organization more than I think the politics. Perhaps one of the greatest challenges is trying to infer meaning from language, and will we be able to put this into what, in terms of what's written, what people really need. And do you think under social science will give us any insight?
It is the culture in each of these. You ask two different questions, which are essentially the same underlying piece, which is human beings communicate in very complicated ways. We sometimes call it culture or language. And there's a worry that when we quantify that, we will lose some of that information. It's not only a worry, it's real. In fact, the point of quantification is mostly to throw away other information so that we can have an abstract summary. If we summarize the wrong piece of it, then we completely lose everything. Absolutely, totally agree. That's why I think the best methods that we come up with are the ones that are not fully automated, but not fully human. The ones that are human empowered, but computer assisted. When you write letters, if you use Microsoft Word or Emacs or Google Docs or whatever it is, what is that? That's computer assisted writing. Like, Microsoft Word doesn't tell me how to write. It helps you write. Okay? So we have a project to do computer-assisted reading. Well, what is that, actually? In fact, let me make it more outrageous. It's computer-assisted conceptualization. Well, wait a second, computers are not allowed to do that. Only we do that. Well, actually, we have a pretty lame working memory. Really lame working memory. Really lame. We have this real limitation. Let me explain how limited our working memory is. When you're writing something, if you rewrite one sentence, what's the first thing you do after you rewrite that one sentence and rearrange 10 words? You read it again. You read it again? You can't remember 10 words and rearrange them? No, because you are inadequate, you are human. Right? That's the problem. Right? So the idea that we can be helped, yeah, of course, right? I mean, there are things that we can have computer-assisted conceptualization. So I have some methods of doing computer-assisted conceptualization. There's a long way there before we get to the place of the robot, but I don't think it's going to happen. But yeah, so we have to pay very close attention to the culture of organizations and the deep qualitative information that individuals have. And that is absolutely the problem in Social Security Administration. There is a culture in the Office of the Chief Actuary that is, they are the center of attention. They've done a very good job of curating the data, but they don't want to share the data with anybody. Years ago that made sense because other people would screw it up. You know? But really what they should do is they should take the data, they should just make it available to the scientific community. They don't even share the data with other parts of the Social Security Administration. Okay. If they shared it with the scientific community and provided replication data sets like we've been doing in academia, you might know, then you would have thousands of social scientists or hundreds of social scientists trying to do better. And if they did better, that would cast no aspersions on the actuaries. It would be great for the actuaries if someone did better. Someone at the end of the day, by the way, has to make the call, and the person who has to make the hard call is the chief actuary, or the office of the chief actuary, or they make the recommendation to the Social Security Board, they make the call, I guess. That's fine, but they should have the best advice. They shouldn't be doing it by themselves. We know that the key contribution of science, the reason why the social sciences are moving from studying problems individually, sort of in our separate monasteries, to a scientific model where we're actually solving problems is because of the community. Because it's much easier to fool ourselves than it is to fool other people. And when we work together and we share data, then one of us can check on the other, and together we can do way better. That little paragraph actually accounts for almost all progress in the last 100 years. So that's a long message.
Can I ask a follow-up question on access to data? I mean, one of the barriers to having more social sciences working like this is that it's often very difficult to get access to this kind of data. Either it's corporately owned and controlled, or, as you mentioned, government isn't willing to give it up. So how have you been able to get access to the data, and what more should we all be doing to push that forward?
Yeah, so access to data is absolutely essential. Let's think of it in a couple of different ways. So one is, at a minimum, academics ought to be sharing data with each other. Okay. That's actually harder than we would think, but we made a lot of progress over the years. In 1995, actually, I wrote an article called, as you know, called Replication, where we encouraged scholars to make data available when they publish their article. We've made enormous progress since then, and actually it's now the norm within academia. Governments have actually made a lot of progress in making data available. As we've seen with Social Security, not all parts of government, but local governments right now are competing with each other to make the bus schedules available so that the high school student can write the app to tell you when the bus is going to come. That's a terrific thing. They should continue on that path, and they are, and that's a really great thing. The next stage is companies. Companies, it used to be that almost all the data in the world was inside the university because we created it. Now almost all the data in the world is in companies and governments. Governments eventually make data available. Companies don't have to, and they now have more data than anybody. There is a treaty to be signed, to be negotiated first, before sign it, I think. But there's a treaty to be made, a grand treaty between the academic world, the commercial world, and governments. And if we can sign this treaty, what would happen, I think, what should happen, is that the companies what do they want? They want access to the data. They don't want the random terror, a government coming in one day and saying, you know what, after 2 weeks you have to delete all your data and all their money also, right? They don't want that. They basically would like to be regulated in some way, right? As long as it's, predictable. Predictability in business is very, very useful. So that's sort of what companies want. What academic researchers want is access to that data. The data that Google, Facebook, and Microsoft and all these companies have, we could learn so much more about human behavior. We would all live longer, healthier, happier lives. And most of the issues that members of Congress care about are actually the issues that social scientists study, like the vast majority of the issues. And we would be able to make progress on everything from teenage pregnancies, unemployment, you name it, right? Every single one of these issues, if we could get access to these data. But it's not fair to ask these companies for access to the data if we're going to hurt them commercially. It's not fair, right? So they have to get something from it. They have to get some promise that the people won't come in and, give them random terror on, they call them privacy nuts. They're actually very important to us, So that's why I think there's a treaty to be made. Like, all three partners would be way better off if we could make this happen. Politically, this is a very difficult thing, but I think somebody should work on it. Maybe even in a building like this. Do we have... Here, come on.
Thank you. Increasingly, large public agencies that serve vulnerable children and families, for example, state child welfare and juvenile justice agencies, are very enamored of big data and predictive analytics, predictive risk modeling. For example, looking at emergency room records to identify families most at risk of abusing their children, raises all kinds of questions about bias and surveillance. I would be very interested in your take on this problem. I know Columbia University is developing a FAIR test procedure, an algorithm to help with those machine learning pipelines. But I would welcome your thoughts about that issue.
Yeah, so this is a really important issue in this area, but also quite general. The advantage of big data is it becomes more and more informative, and that means we can solve more and more problems, but it's also potentially more and more intrusive. And so what's going to happen? There's going to be a lot of treaty signs. Some of them will be signed like every year, they're different. Right? But whatever they are, there's going to be some compromise because all of these issues are really important. Like we want to maintain individual privacy, and also we like to solve these societal problems. Like my main answer to this is, please don't forget all of those parts. Right? Some people in politics say it's not, it's just a privacy. It's a privacy violation. Nothing is ever only a privacy violation. Right? It also produces good. So the good is, the privacy. How much privacy would you be willing to give up to live 10 years longer than your expected lifespan? Right? It's never put that way. It's only put, can I look at your email without your permission? Because the answer to that question is no. Okay? But if the benefit were clear also, then it's not like the answer is necessarily yes. If your life were miserable, right? These are difficult questions. Okay? But I just want us to remember the good. Okay? And there are ways of using very private data, at least by academics, in ways that can benefit everybody. Okay? A majority of children who have cancer in the United States are in randomized experiments. That is, we decide on their care based on flips of coins in very scientific ways that benefit them also. Okay? But the parents of these kids have every single one of them given permission. And you know what? We all benefit because of that. When we give up data in the interest of science, big deal, right? And, so it could be that somebody at Google or the government or somewhere is like looking at something they shouldn't be looking at. If we find them, we send them to jail, okay? But still, they can look at it and really organize us, okay? But if it's something that could cause us both to live 10 years longer, or solve the crime problem, or eliminate the problem of people dying from pain medicines, or any number of other issues, I just don't want anybody to forget the good. That's all. So.
How do you see collaborations developing between quantitative fields and social science fields? I mean, you have your institute, but do you see more interdisciplinary work in the future, more traditional academic walls or societal walls breaking down as people merge their talents?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think I give one answer with two parts. In the social sciences, more and more social scientists, economists, anthropologists, political scientists, sociologists, psychologists are being trained as social scientists psychologists. Not completely, but more and more. More and more, there's co-authorships across fields. More and more, we know what people are doing in different fields. When we wrote our paper on Social Security, to respond to Myron again, we were very interested. It was very important for us to figure out the culture of that organization and the psychology of people in a very difficult position with enormous political pressure. And so we studied that. Actually, in psychology, there were people that worked very hard on that, on these kinds of issues, and how we might be biased on certain circumstances, with other kinds of ways of recognizing that we're inadequate, frankly, that's what that literature shows. And it was very important to us, incredibly important. And so there's much more of that. So that's one part is yes. And the other part is also yes. The other part is the methodological subfields of these different disciplines. Political methodology within political science, econometrics within economics, sociological methodology within sociology, psychometrics and psychological statistics within psychology, and cliometrics within history, chemometrics within chemistry, you name it. Okay? These are all these are methodological subdisciplines submerged within substantive fields, but they are now talking to each other. And they're forming a sort of meta-scientific discipline. We actually have a name for it. We're calling it data science. Okay? Whatever the heck that is. It has to be a name different than all the existing names, right? Even though there's a lot of existing names. And it's great that there's these communications because the solutions in one field turn out to be solutions in the other. We have a seminar at Harvard every Wednesday at noon. You're all invited. Free lunch, by the way. It's an applied statistics. It's billed as a tour of Harvard statistical innovations and applications with weekly stops in different disciplines. And I'll give you one example from us. We had an astronomer we had a political scientist come on one week predicting the number of presidential vetoes a year. Now, if you look at that, it goes like this. The average is around 50. Okay? Some zeros, some more. And there's some statistical methods to predict that. There's some innovations in statistical methods to deal with a particular type of counts in presidential vetoes. Next week, someone came from the Chandra X-ray Observatory. What the heck is that? So that's a satellite that orbits the planet. It's a telescope in the X-ray spectrum. Okay, so what's that? What is it? What does the data look like? So it's basically a little checkerboard, and in each of the squares of the checkerboard, it counts photons, little particles of light. And so it's counting photons. It counts. Okay? And if you look at the data, you say, well, how many counts are there per period? And the person standing in front of the room said, well, it goes up and down, sometimes it's zero. It's about 15. and so it turned out that the political scientists got some methods that the astronomers were developing, and the astronomers got some methods that the political scientists were using, and there was seamless communication of information, even though neither one had any idea what the other one was talking about. So that's the kind of thing that I think we make a lot of progress on. So it's a great question. He wants to stop us.
He's got to pick a butt.
Sure. We should, because I know your time's limited too. So I just wanted to say the line that was occurring to me from William Gibson, the cyberpunk novelist, was, the future has already arrived, it's just unevenly distributed. I'd like to do a huge thank you to Gary for giving us a glimpse of that exciting future.